individual or entity by holding more than 25% of the shares of the company is regarded as a beneficial owner. That information will not only be available to the, I suppose, regulated bodies and regulating bodies, but it will also be available to the public. Our understanding is that while the PPS numbers and residential addresses of beneficial owners is required to be held by the company, that information will not be available to the public. Obviously, full access to the register is available to the bodies that are listed there on the slide. So that's been, in effect, a swift development in the case of beneficial ownership of companies. I'm going to spend a little more time in dealing with the rules concerning beneficial ownership of trusts. Because we've had these regulations now pursuant to a statutory instrument that was signed by Minister Pascal Donoghue on the 29th of January of this year. And these regulations, I think, are a bit of an amalgam of trying to deal with some of the issues from the 4th directive and some under the 5th directive. So the regulations apply to all trusts with Irish trustees, irrespective of whether those trusts have a tax effect. So it includes certainly family trusts, pension trusts, bear trusts, any collective investment vehicles, which are often structured in this way. A beneficial owner of a trust includes any natural persons on whose behalf a transaction or activity is being conducted. There's quite an important distinction in terms of between trusts and companies, because in relation to trusts, in addition to the requirement to verify the identity of settlor, trustees, protector, beneficiaries, and any other natural persons exercising ultimate control, it is necessary to identify any natural person in the beneficial class. So unlike a company, we don't have a 25% threshold relative to the value in trust. So if I am a trustee and I'm a trustee of a family trust, and there are, let's say, 15 individual beneficiaries, then it is necessary that I, as a trustee, maintain a register. That has to include the verified details of certainly all the beneficiaries who are in receipt of benefits out of the trust. And it's also necessary to have the ability to obtain such information in relation to any beneficiaries who may not yet have received information if they are going to receive a benefit. Now, I think as a solicitor, I probably concede that I've drafted trusts in the past where the class of beneficiaries, particularly if it's a discretionary trust, has probably been broader than was absolutely necessary because it was viewed as a sensible thing to do. This now brings, I suppose, into focus the increased responsibility on the trustees to maintain a relevant register of beneficial ownership. Personally, I act as a protector of a number of trusts. These are trusts outside the jurisdiction, and I have tried to negotiate whether it's necessary for my personal tax number to be provided to a jurisdiction far, far away from Ireland, so that my role as protector of trusts in that jurisdiction can be accurately verified. And I'm quite apprehensive about that. I've lost that couple. There you go. But I do have a concern that some of the information that's going to get circulated between trustees to their tax authority under CRS, that information then being transmitted to Revenue in Ireland in relation to Irish resident individuals is going to effectively include information with the names of beneficiaries, which is matched to the value of benefits they have received. In the case of a protector, obviously there's a zero benefit, but you're on the list, which is not, I think, I would say something that as a protector I'm comfortable with, but that's the nature of the world. So the information in relation to beneficial owners is quite extensive: date of birth, nationality, and residential addresses for those who are more than one. So what should the trustees do? And it's important to be aware that when these regulations were signed on the 29th of January, they were immediately part of our law, and the requirement to have these registers maintained became one as of that date. So the trustees are responsible for keeping and maintaining the register, collecting all the information. There's a duty to take reasonable steps to hold accurate information concerning beneficial ownership. So this means if beneficiaries are to either die, be excluded from benefit in whatever way it may happen, or become beneficiaries who are intended to receive distributions for the first time, then the register is going to have to be updated as soon as practicable. And it's also necessary to record the basis on which the register is reviewed. So for those of us who, as trustees or advisors to trustees, would have a calendar of activity in relation to a trust, it is necessary to include the establishment of a beneficial ownership register and the updating of it as one of those ongoing action items. Now, as the regulations are in place since January, the information in the beneficial ownership register is available to revenue commissioners or state competent bodies at their request. This is obviously relevant in terms of the managing of trust records to ensure that the information is held, that it is held on an appropriate basis. And as a solicitor, who's being in a firm where our advice benefits from legal privilege, it's obviously important for us that the information is held in a manner which is segregated from any information which may be privileged, so that if the revenue commissioners or another body come looking for information, then they can receive what they're entitled to, but without being required to trip through any information which is not within their procurement. Now, I'll come on a little bit later to talk in more detail about the requirement for information in trust registers to become available to the public. That is a requirement of the 5th directive, which forms part of our law, and Ireland is required to transpose the obligations to make beneficial ownership information concerning trusts available to the public, in effect, by 10 January 2020, which is not too far away. that just lists the entities which are entitled to information at the moment, so we'll cover that. But the key one really that we're coming on to now is the final bullet point on the slide, which goes to the entitlement of any natural legal person who can demonstrate a legitimate interest is going to become entitled to beneficial ownership information concerning a trust structure. And I was concerned that a person should need to demonstrate a significant, have to cross a significant barrier to demonstrate a legitimate interest. I don't believe that a blogger with a tenor actually would meet that criteria. And as we'll see, this is a matter of that's been subject of some significant public discussion in other jurisdictions. I'm just going to spend just a few minutes talking about states, because interestingly, the beneficial ownership register does apply to states. Beneficial ownership is said to be vested in the personal representatives. They're required to maintain a register. A lot of the information that's required beyond the beneficial ownership register for an estate should already be held by professional advisors in any event. As solicitors, we're required by the Law Society to obviously verify the identity of our clients, under the Law Society guidance to verify the identity of beneficiaries, and obviously it's not possible to apply for a grant of representation without verifying the identity of the deceased through a death certificate. So this is an additional requirement which is now relevant, and if assets pass into a will trust, then the register for that will trust will need to be established. If it passes the beneficiaries, absolutely, then it would be necessary to verify their identity before they receive the entitlement that are due to them. One of the points that's probably relevant to make is that, as solicitors, we're subject of guidelines issued by the Law Society. Those of us here present who work in regulated financial businesses are regulated by the central bank. It and the Department of Finance will issue guidelines from time to time. Common reporting standard for the OECD, if you need to get into the detailed interpretation of it, is only achievable by reviewing the guidelines from the OECD. So we're moving into a situation where responsibilities as professionals are not clearly delineated by law, but they're now effectively governed by guidelines. And as the statement from the central bank, who I referred to earlier, said about guidelines, he characterized them as soft law. So they're to be adhered to. So what's coming next? And I guess this is just want to spend a few minutes on the requirement for trust registers to be available to persons with a legitimate interest. So HMRC is carrying out a consultation in the UK. I think this is probably certainly has been very helpful to me to understand the likely approach that could be taken in this jurisdiction. And STEP has been actively involved in putting forward what I believe needs to be an appropriate threshold to be achieved in order for a person to establish that they have a legitimate interest in information. And that, in effect, has been characterized as, referring to somebody who has an active involvement in anti-money laundering or counter-terrorist financing activity, and who has reason to believe that a particular trust or person is involved with money laundering or terrorist financing. And this is obviously an important matter from our perspective, because Minister Pascal Donoghue is expected to make regulations concerning the access to trust information. Technically, it's required to be done by January 2010 in accordance with the fifth directive. So this is an issue which we should be keenly aware of, because there is potential, if the bar set in relation to legitimate interest is too low, for requests for information about beneficial ownership of trusts to be coming from many different sources. STEP, again, as part of the public policy role which I participate in, did get an opinion from Hugh Tomlinson in the UK a number of years ago concerning the implications of the fifth directive. And his view, obviously, that this would have formed part of a lobbying approach by STEP, which hasn't unfortunately borne fruit, was that there was actually a failure by the EU to be proportionate in coming to the fifth directive, because there wasn't a distinction made between trusts which own or control businesses and trusts which simply hold passive wealth. And he expressed the view that the impact of the fifth directive would infringe the rights of individuals in relation to their personal data, and would also infringe the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU. So this is I guess, an area that's going to get attention over the next number of months. It's worth noting that when the central register of beneficial ownership for companies was established earlier this year, becoming effective in June of this year, the only exception to the availability of beneficial ownership information concerning companies relates to minors, and there were no other limitations in the regulations. It's worth referring to a French case that took place a number of years ago, and again, legislation at that time required beneficial ownership information to be available on the public register. It's found to be an infringement of the rights of the individual concerned, because it fails to specify the basis on which the register could be consulted, and meant that it provided for a disproportionate impact on privacy. Now, as inevitably happens, the case had to be lost. A revised register for access has since been established in France. So that, in summary, I suppose, brings us to the impact of the register on trusts. There's a requirement under the fifth directive that the information be held and maintained. That is a present and ongoing responsibility for trustees. The next phase is going to concern the circumstances in which that information may become available to members of the public who can show a legitimate interest. Just going to finish briefly on MFP6. These legislative developments in the EU just do come very, very quickly. This is going to complement, obviously, what's happened in the earlier legislation. It is going to require Ireland to constitute more offences as criminal activity under our anti-money laundering legislation, including offences of aiding and abetting, attempting to commit an offence. And it's also going to talk about, enhancing collaboration between member states to make the exchange of information more manageable. And I had the opportunity on the fringes of a meeting to discuss this with the senior revenue official, and he was explaining that under FATCA, Ireland had got quite a lot of useful information from the US about Irish persons holding investments in the US. He speculated that they also got details of every student who has gone on a J1 visa and opened a bank account in the US over the previous number of years, which is not exactly relevant information from their perspective, but this is one, I think, of the features of information exchange, that the volume of data that's moving from country to country is quite significant. Final comment would be that, I would see myself as an advisor to families. There's quite a constructive tension between the views I would hold as an advisor to families and those held by, say, significant regulated financial institutions. Their priority seems to be to have as much information as is feasible available on public registers, so that the financial institution can rely on those public registers in the discharge of their legislative responsibilities to prevent money laundering. So there's quite a competitive tension, I think, probably fair to say, between those of us who are focused on advising families, or I would see my role primarily, and the roles of the bigger financial institutions. And that all creates lots of interesting debate. Okay, thank you very much. I hope that was useful.
Just because we have a very wide class of intentions and
I think that's right, and I think actually the position in relation to pension trusts is indicative as well, because in pension trusts, my view would be that until an employee reaches pension age and becomes, I suppose, somebody who's applying to draw down their pension, it's not actually necessary for the trustees to verify the identity of that person. And in a similar way, I would think, if we have a class of discretionary beneficiaries, I think those who are in receipt of benefits clearly are individuals whose identity must have been verified. before they receive a benefit. But I would not regard promoter members of a discretionary class who haven't featured in trustee considerations as needing to be verified. Certainly
When
doesn't
the
need
right
to.
arises,
Right.
when the entitlement
I think that's correct. I think we will also potentially see circumstances where individuals who may feel they are closer to benefiting from trust structures than the trustees may believe to be the case are likely to be applicants for information. That's going to create some interesting issues.
We will actually have a question and answer section at 12 o'clock, so we just might leave it till then if that's okay, Aileen. But we will welcome your questions, as I'm sure Corey will. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Jim O'Leary. Jim is a consultant and researcher. He was formerly chief economist at Davy Stock Brokers. He has lectured in economics in NYU. He has been a senior economic advisor in the Department of Finance and a member of numerous boards in both the public and private sectors. So we also have slides for Jim that are not in your pack, but they will be made available to you.
Okay, good morning. It's nice to be here. I guess the reason I am here is because I did some research last year for Community Foundation for Ireland on this question of intergenerational wealth transfers and the possible implications for philanthropy. And that research was published in a report called Legacies for Good. I have no idea how you might get your hands on the report. I refer you to the Community Foundation for Ireland, who have the copyright on it. So, just to give you an overview of what I'm going to say, I'm going to speak very briefly about the motivation behind that research. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the distribution of household wealth in Ireland and its growth in recent years. I'm going to spend a little bit of time taking you through how I constructed my estimates and projections of the intergenerational transfer of wealth at death. That exercise was a bit like going into an hitherto unexplored cave of unknown dimensions with a small torch. So that's by way of signaling that the result of the exercise is not the last word. It might be necessary to go back into the cave with a bigger torch at some stage in the future. Then I go on to make some remarks the purpose of which are to kind of benchmark Ireland from a giving perspective, and particularly from the perspective of charitable bequests. And finally, I'll say a few things about policy issues relating to this space. Okay, so without going through the details of this slide, I guess cutting to the chase, the motivation behind the Community Foundation's decision to do this work was principally to draw attention to and raise awareness of intergenerational wealth transfers as a possible source of giving to the charitable and philanthropic sector, right? And frankly, it's a source that is greatly underexploited at the moment. When you benchmark Ireland against other jurisdictions, it would appear, on the basis, albeit of imperfect data and incomplete data, that we are laggards when it comes to charitable bequests. And it would also appear to be the case that, relative again to the leading jurisdictions in the area, our philanthropic sector is underdeveloped. And by philanthropy, I suppose I mean the practice of large-scale planned giving. We have a reputation for being a very generous country when it comes to charity, but it would appear from the data available that much of our giving is small-scale and spontaneous or ad hoc in nature. We're very good in terms of responding to appeals in emergency situations, in situations of humanitarian crisis, but we don't appear to be as good when it comes to the long-term planned giving that underpins the activities of foundations like the CFI. So that was really the motivation behind this study. So, what do we know about household wealth in Ireland? Well, we know a lot more than we used to know, because up to about 10 years ago, we knew precious little. We had a wealth of economic data on essentially economic activity and income-related aspects of households' finances, but we had very little in the way of data on household wealth. That vacuum has been filled in recent years from a number of sources, one of them being the CSO itself, which in 2013 published its Household Finance and Consumption Survey, the results of which were based on a survey of a representative sample of Irish households. And as with many such surveys, one of the problems with the data that came from that exercise is that there is strong reason to believe that the wealth of the wealthiest households was considerably underestimated, because the wealthiest households tend to be underrepresented in such surveys and tend to underreport their wealth when they are included. The CSO is currently updating its 2013 survey. I think the field work on the latest one is about to be completed, and therefore the results should be published within the next 6 to 12 months, and I await them with interest. The value of the CSO stuff is that, unlike the other sources, it gives you some information on the distribution of household wealth along various dimensions, like age. None of the other sources provide information on how household wealth is distributed by age. And when it comes to intergenerational wealth transfers, that is an important ingredient in the analysis, as you might imagine. So the two other sources that we used in this survey, or in this research, were the central bank's quarterly financial accounts, which, as the name on the tin suggests, takes place 4 times a year. It's pretty timely, it's pretty regular, and is reasonably comprehensive. But it doesn't include every aspect or element of household wealth. It doesn't, for example, include the value of land, right? And finally, a very interesting source is Credit Suisse, the bank. They publish an annual, comprehensive, global, in fact, international, I would say the word is global, survey or set of data on household wealth. And Ireland is included in that. And those figures are very interesting, particularly from the point of view of the perspective that they give on the distribution, the size distribution of household wealth, not only in Ireland, but in virtually every other country in the world. So it allows Ireland to be put in a comparative context from that point of view. Okay, very quickly running through some of the headline numbers here. As of the time I was doing this research, the central bank's most recent estimate put total household wealth in Ireland at 727 billion euros. That related to 2017 Q4. There have been 3 quarterlies published by the central bank since, so the figure of 727 billion has gone up by about 5%. It's now about 770 billion. That's a new record high. And it means that household wealth in Ireland has at this stage recovered fully from the consequences and the depredations, if you like, of the economic and financial crisis, and is at this stage something like 7, 8, 9% ahead of where it was at its peak, its previous peak before the crisis. In terms of composition, approximately half of that wealth represents net housing wealth, which is the value of housing assets less the value of outstanding debt or mortgages on those properties. And something approaching a sixth of the total reflects pension assets. And that's important from the point of view of the way I approached this subject, because I subtracted pension assets from the total in order to come up with my estimate of how much was transferable from one generation to the next, for reasons that I'll come to in a moment. So in terms of averages, 425,000 per household is the average across the total population of households, average wealth, or about 210,000 per adult. Now those figures will have gone up a little bit since, perhaps by something of the order of 5 or 6%. So these numbers mean that Ireland is up in the top flight of nations when it comes to household wealth, as you might imagine. The distribution of household wealth. These are figures that, despite 35 years working as a macroeconomist, I had never worked with before I did this work for the Community Foundation. And I was surprised and shocked by what I discovered. So, we have, let's take the top 20%, the second column from the left of the figures there signify is that the top 20%, the wealthiest 20% of households, own 80% of total household wealth. The average per adult, and the mean figure here is per adult, 872,000 amongst that top 20%, and there's something like 700,000 people in that category. If we move along to the right of the table, to the top 5% and top 1%, let's look at the top 1%. The top 1% is estimated to own a third of total household wealth. Each adult, or adults on average, in that top 1% have a personal net worth of 7.2 million. And there's about 34,000 people in this category, right? In fact, Credit Suisse estimated that in 2017, there were 125,000 individuals in Ireland with a net worth greater than the equivalent of $1 million. And there was something like 13 or 14,000 individuals with a net worth greater than $5 million. And those numbers will have gone up since. And a feature of the distribution of household wealth in recent times is that it has become more unequal. So if you look at the Credit Suisse numbers for 2018, right, these numbers are for 2017, the numbers for 2018 are the top 5% owns 57.5% of total household wealth, and the top 1% owns 35%. Right? What about the distribution of household wealth by age? These numbers are derived from the CSO's 2013 survey, so they're a little bit dated, but I wouldn't think that the distribution by age has changed dramatically since. If you look at the column on the right, under 35s are estimated to account for about 3.5% of household wealth. 35 to 44 is 13.3, etc. If we go up to the over 65s, which is the slice of the population that's of most interest to us, they are estimated to own roughly a third of total household wealth. And if you break that down into its three constituent age cohorts, 65 to 74, 75 to 84, and over 85s, the corresponding percentages are given there. The over 85s own 2.7%, 75 to 84s own 9.2%, and the 65 to 74s own 20.6% of total household wealth. If we look briefly at the figures in the mean net wealth column, first of all, if you look at over 65s compared with 55 to 64, well, up to that point, the pattern is as you would expect. As the age of the head of household increases, so the average wealth of the household also increases. But that pattern yields to a kind of a plateau effect when you reach retirement age. So the average net wealth of the over 65s is not much different from the average net wealth of the 55 to 64s. The reasons for that are fairly clear-cut, fairly obvious. The balance between income and expenditure changes when you retire, and some households at that stage are drawing down their wealth. Other households are so wealthy that they're still accumulating, but on average, taking all households in the category, in the age category, what happens is that there's a plateau effect, right? Wealth flattens out. If you look at the last number of rows of data, you'll see there's a bit of an anomaly here. It would appear that the 75 to 84s on average are significantly less wealthy than the age cohort immediately younger than them and the age cohort immediately older than them. Do I think that is a reflection of the underlying reality? No. I think what we're seeing here, unfortunately, is the consequence of a statistical, I wouldn't call it an error, but a statistical deficiency, in that when you're doing surveys and the sample size of the particular small group within the survey is quite small, you can produce results that are not necessarily accurate, right? Okay. Okay, so if I was interested in doing a really quick and dirty exercise and just drawing a line under it at the earliest possible opportunity, I might have done so at this point. I might have said, oh, what the hell? There's no point in doing a whole lot more digging and mining and collating and transforming of data. Let's just make the assumption that over the next 20 years, all of those who are currently aged over 65 will pass on and leave their wealth behind. And therefore, something like a third of total household wealth will pass on intergenerationally over that period. A critical problem with that kind of simplifying back of the envelope assumption relates to longevity. So I have two questions for you to check how with it you are when it comes to life expectancy. My first question is, what proportion of those currently aged 65 to 74 are expected to live for another 20 years or more? What do you think?
30%.
30%? Anyone advance on 30%? 70%. Well, you're about 100 years ahead. Actually, the answer is 45%. And the answer to the second question here, what proportion of those currently aged 75 to 84 are expected to live for another 20 plus years? Bear in mind, simple arithmetic, those currently aged 75 to 84 are prospectively going to be aged 95 to 104 in 20 years' time. So what proportion of them do you think are still going to be with us? The answer is 10%, right? So, you have to factor these statistics about life expectancy into your analysis of intergenerational transfers. In fact, there are 3 questions that you have to address here. What proportion of people in each of the key cohorts, age cohorts, are projected to die by 2036? What is the marital status of those who are projected to die? Because if they're married, or if they have a civil partner, the spouse of the civil partner could survive. And that brings us to the 3rd question. What is the probability that those who die will leave a spouse or civil partner who will survive beyond 2036? So those 3 questions have to be addressed in order to derive estimates of the proportion of household wealth available for intergenerational transfer at death over the next 20 years. And this is the result. So I also included the 55 to 64s, right, who have about a quarter of total household wealth, and who will transfer something like 9% of that wealth to the next generation at death over the coming 20 years. 65 to 74s will transfer about 36.5% of their wealth. 75 to 84s will transfer about 90%, and those aged 85 plus, well, I just impose the assumption that they will transfer 100%. And so that means that taking them all together and weighting them appropriately, something just north of 20%, by my estimates, of total household wealth will be available for intergenerational transfer over the next 20 years. Right? Okay. Now, as I adverted to earlier, and as you noticed from the pattern of wealth as the household ages, there is a plateau effect. There's a plateau effect reached at retirement age.